For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. Gareth Newham of the Institute for Security Studies joins me to unpack this year's crime statistics. South Africa's crime statistics for 2013-14 were recently released. Can you provide a brief overview of the stats, and what should people in South Africa take note of?
Well, these crime statistics should be a wake-up call to all South Africans. For the first time in 20 years, since 1994, we've had 2 consecutive years where murder has increased. So there are now almost 1,500 more murders taking place a year than there were 2 years ago. And that's important to note because over the last 20 years, the murder rate has dropped by over 50%. We used to have a murder rate of around 67 murders per 100,000 people in 1994, and it dropped down to 31 murders per 100,000 people 2 years ago. But now, and it's only increased in 2 other years in the last 20 years. So we've been very fortunate to see the reduction in murder over the last 20 years overall for a variety of reasons. But now that they've started to go up, you should be worried. That means that there's not just a blip, it's not just a 1-year increase, it is now a shift in the trend where more people are dying. 47 South Africans are dying every day in South Africa on average because they're murdered. Now that is, should be a wake-up call, and why that is happening needs to be thoroughly investigated. There are various causes of murder. The police say that, and we know from a lot of research, that most murders, 2/3 pretty much, take place between people who know each other, who live in the same communities, often know each other by name. And the profiles are largely young men who are either unemployed or underemployed, who often get into a fight. It's about getting into a conflict about something, could be about girlfriends, money, whatever. And that fight escalates and somebody gets either stabbed or beaten or sometimes shot and the person dies. So that drives most of our murder. So for every 1 woman that gets murdered, there's 6 to 7 males that get murdered. And that's what's driving our murder rate. That is not unique. That is pretty much what murder looks like around the world. However, what we've seen is big decreases in assaults over the last few years. So there are fewer serious assaults that are the causes that drive murder. So you've got murder going up and assaults going down. But the crime categories that are very worrying to us because they contribute to the murder rate, about up to 20% of murders are robberies. And robberies have dramatically increased. There were 13,500 more robberies in the most recent crime statistics than there were the previous year. And robberies occur when an armed criminal or group of criminals attacks somebody walking to work or walking the streets or in their homes or in their places of work or while driving their cars to steal from them. And if they resist, will shoot or stab them, and that contributes to the murder rate. So those are the 2 big things that we take from these crime stats, that the most serious crime, murder and attempted murder that's linked to that, are going up by 5%. 809 murders more than the previous year, on top of another 650 murders more than the year before that, and then these dramatic increases in robberies. So those are what we think the South African public need to focus on, because if we don't start acting now, we're going to see a lot more people being killed and attacked in their homes and their workplaces than would otherwise necessarily have to be the case if we start acting now.
Why is murder and attempted murder going up?
We have to look at the data on where it's going up before we can understand why it's going up. And that is an issue that needs to be resolved quite urgently in South Africa. The police release the crime statistics 6 months out of date once a year for all the police stations. But they have a system that we record every single murder every 24 hours on a geographical basis. So they can tell us which street corners, which neighborhoods have the most murders. We know from research undertaken in Latin America, in places like Mexico and Colombia, that around 5% of specific locations account for up to 80% of the murders in certain cities. And that's because they use the data that we have to identify these patterns. And then you can go into those areas and find out exactly what's going on there. And if you want to reduce murder, then as I say, if it's a robbery driving the murder up, then it's a policing response that's required urgently. If it's more to do with interpersonal violence, it's going to require a different, more longer-term response to get the murder rate down. But at least you know that you have a plan in place to respond to the reasons why murder is going up. Right now, although the police have that information, because they won't work with universities, they won't work with research institutions, they refuse to share that data, we can't bring our collective knowledge, experience and wisdom to bear to work with the police and other agencies such as social welfare, education departments, health, to reduce murder. So until there is that openness from the police side to share information and to develop strategies where they might not be the lead department, it might be other departments that require far more of a lead in these cases, we're unlikely to see murders to go down or change.
What needs to be done to address the increase in robbery?
Reducing robberies is purely a policing function, and the police are the only ones who can reduce robbery. because robberies are committed by armed gangs, usually carrying weapons, or individuals carrying weapons. And you can't expect the civilian population to address armed gangs with weapons. That's why we employ police, we train them and give them weapons. They are the legitimate use of state force to enforce the law. And wherever we've seen big reductions in robberies, whether it's from South America or to New York, it's been a policing response. And South Africa in 2009, with the Gauteng police, managed to bring down robberies by a large amount. So when robberies are going up, it means that increasing numbers of particularly young men are involved in robberies. The risk of getting caught is not there because the police do not have a strategy to identify the way the robberies are taking place, arrest the criminals involved in these attacks, and those that buy the stolen goods from them, the networks that support robberies, often organized criminal syndicates. And that's why robbery is going up. So that robbery is going up is a clear indicator that the South African Police Service, with all their resources, 68 billion rand a year at the moment, plus about 195,000 personnel across the country, making us very well policed. We have one police officer, one person in the SAPS for every 346 civilians, compared to the United Nations recommendation of one police officer to 450 civilians. So we don't have a shortage of resources. What we have a shortage of is a senior management team who are able to use these resources in a very focused and structured way to bring those criminals before the courts. And we know it can be done because it's been done before. So that it's not happening now means that there's a serious problem at the highest levels of the South African Police Service.
Some of the very serious concerns raised about the police in the past couple of years include political meddling in police appointments and promotion, increased police brutality, as well as a serious lack of skills, particularly with regard to quelling public protests. What is your opinion on this?
Well, we've seen from the National Development Plan that they talk about a serial crisis of top management in the South African Police Service. And that's very clear because we've had 5 different national commissioners in pretty much the last 5 or 6 years, either in acting position or in appointments, 2 acting and 3 permanent. So if you keep on changing your national commissioners every 2 years, you're going to have an issue of instability at the top of the organization. Because every time a new person comes in, they might have new ideas, they appoint new staff, they do different things differently. Unfortunately, the reason why we've had this crisis is because since the appointment of Jackie Celebi in 2000, the president, who has the constitutional right to appoint that person, a person to that post, has chosen to appoint somebody who's personally loyal to him as the president, in his private capacity often. So Jackie Celebi was very loyal to Thabo Mbeki. But fortunately, that we now know that Jackie Celebi was also corrupt. So he was fighting corruption, and during that period of time, crime intelligence was used for political purposes, not fighting organized crime. He was eventually placed on special leave and received a jail sentence. There was an acting period with Tim Williams. Then there was Bheki Cele being appointed. Within 2 years, he was embroiled in a whole leasing scandal. He was found to be incompetent by a board of inquiry, who also recommended further investigations into corruption at the highest level of the police, which weren't undertaken. He was fired. We had then Notlantla Makonazi, a very seasoned, well-experienced police officer. He was shafted after he took action to suspend Richard Mdluli, the head of National Crime Intelligence, facing a large raft of criminal charges for violent crime and for fraud and corruption. But he's very close to the president. The president's very keen to protect Richard Mdluli, because obviously Richard Mdluli must have something on him, otherwise he would just let those processes unfold. And so he was then replaced by Ria Piecha, also a person with a social work background, some experience to executive management functions on big boards such as APSA, but absolutely no experience in policing, no qualifications in policing, no ability or background showing that you can manage operationally a large public sector organization. So there's been this history of instability in the senior management of the South African Police Service. And unfortunately, with Ria Piecha, that instability has continued. Very good, well-experienced police officials, 2 deputy national commissioners were forced out against the labour regulations. They've won their cases in the Labour Court and now taking it to the CCMA. Police officers investigating corruption at the highest level of the police agency, the head of the Hawks in KwaZulu-Natal, Johan Boysen, a Colonel Roos in charge of crime intelligence who was trying to fight corruption, crime intelligence. She's been forcing them out. She doesn't want them in the police, but she's been protecting people like Richard Mdluli. She has not taken further action against him. She's been protecting people like the Provincial Commissioner of the Western Cape, who is now being investigated for his alleged links to drug lords. He's received cash from them. She's protecting the Provincial Commissioner of of KwaZulu-Natal, who was found to be dishonest in the Board of Inquiry into the fitness of Becky Cele, and more recently had a whole range of indicting, was slammed in a judgment internal hearing, where it was found that she had interfered with police investigations into corruption in KwaZulu-Natal to try and stop them. So you've got a situation where the pattern that we're starting to see emerge is one in which the National Commissioner has very little credibility because she keeps on protecting those that are facing serious charges or allegations of corruption, forcing those cops who want to do a good job, who are proven to be doing good jobs and are proven to be honest, out of the organisation. And then, of course, the Marikana thing, being evasive, covering up, not being truthful before that commission inquiry. So really having lost the confidence of many hard-working, honest men and women in the South African Police Service and the public at large. Every second week there's another scandal with the National Commissioner. So we really think that if the National Development Plan recommendations are looked at carefully, that's the way forward. We need to have people at the top of the organisation who are honest, know what they're doing when it comes to policing, know how to fight crime, know how to fix the organisation and get on with the job.
It has been noted that the police have made higher numbers of arrests, but the numbers of the convictions have remained static, pointing to the fact that aspects of the criminal justice system remain problematic and as such are a hindrance to crime reduction. What are the main problems leading to this scenario?
Well, what we've seen, for instance, is large increases in the budget of the police, more personnel. So over the last 10 years, almost 70,000 additional posts being granted to the South African Police Service. So 10 years ago, there was about 134,000 people. Now there are 195,000 people. So you can see this big increase. It's actually decreased the last 2 years because of budgetary constraints. And that has definitely resulted in more roadblocks, more search and seizure operations. We can see this. You can see all the trends going up and more arrests. So 10 years ago, the police were arresting about 1 million people. As of last year, they're arresting 1.7 million people. So almost 700,000 more arrests in 10 years. But when you look at the National Prosecuting Authority, the prosecuting authority then takes those arrests and evidence and decides whether to prosecute people so that they can go to jail if they're found guilty in a court of law. We see that over the last 10 years, there are 84,000 fewer cases being finalized, although there have been increases in the budget. So the system's not working. Those increased arrests aren't leading to increased cases before the courts that lead to increased criminals going to jail. Actually, the opposite has been happening. More arrests, but fewer cases going to be finalized before the courts. Now we need to look into that more carefully because it's not an easy to know why that's happening just by looking at the numbers. It could be, for instance, that the National Prosecuting Authority is not properly resourced. They're having problems. They might have problems with the training of their staff, the morale of their staff. There might be issues there. It could be that the detective services, we know, haven't been given the kind of resources, training and expertise that they require, so that the prosecuting authority simply can't act on the dockets they receive. And that might be a reason. So it might be weak detective services. And there could be a range of other issues to do with court processes. But there needs to be a study to find out why this is happening. Because what's going on is that the police are now arresting, almost 2 million people every year. When you get arrested by the police, it's not a pleasant experience. These arrests often take place out in the streets. 40% of those are for serious crimes, 60% are for crimes less serious than shoplifting. So it's people making noise in the street or drinking in public. It's doing relatively petty things, but the cops are now arresting them. They often beat them up when they arrest them and brutalize them, tear gas them often, then drive them around and let them go. Or take them to the police station, keep them overnight, let them go. So you're getting millions of larger young men again, having this negative experience with the police every year, year on year. They don't go to jail. Nothing happens to them. They just get brutalized by the police, let go, arrested, brutalized by the police, let go. So it means that they're not scared of the criminal justice system. They start getting used to it. And we know from international research that pattern of behavior and police engagement with the population results in larger numbers of young men getting angry, frustrated, seeing the police as the enemy, and more willing to be involved in crime and break the law. So bad policing can actually facilitate crime. It can actually undermine safety as much as good policing can do the opposite. And what we have at the moment is a very bad pattern of policing in South Africa.
Prevention of crime cannot be solely the responsibility of the police. What else can be done to reduce crime?
It's very true that the police are hamstrung when it comes to lots of certainly interpersonal violent crimes, and they should really be focusing on the crimes that they can reduce. But we need to then put in plan strategies for reducing the factors that lead to crime. And we had a plan called the National crime prevention strategy, which was adopted in 1996 and wasn't ever really fully implemented. In fact, 90% of that plan wasn't implemented. But that plan was based on some of the latest international thinking, which has been developed quite considerably since then. And it recognizes that if you really want to have sustainable reductions in violence, you've got to start working with children and young people. Violence is a learned behavior. And when kids, particularly in violent households where there's inconsistent parenting or child abuse, or they see domestic violence, violence between their parents, largely against their mothers, that leads to a trauma and a violent response as they become young adults. So we've seen experiments done as far back as the 1960s that working with social workers in high-risk families or caregivers of children who are at risk of violent behavior, just using social workers and up to as little as 2 hours a week can reduce the extent to which these young people by the age of 19 are arrested for criminal behavior, experiment or abuse drugs and alcohol, or for pregnant. So you solve a lot of problems when you start looking at the root factors that result in violent behavior. And I think that's what we don't have enough of in South Africa. We tend to think we have a crime problem, we must just put all our money into policing. In fact, we have a crime problem because we're putting all our money into policing and we're not doing enough to put money into, for instance, social workers. So we've hired almost 70,000 more police officers over the last 10 years, but we have a shortage of almost 60,000 social workers. Because if you look at the existing government plans around early childhood development, around the kinds of things we know work against violence reduction, we don't have the social workers to carry out these plans. And so we need to have a fundamental shift in our thinking. We need to start having fewer cops who are more professional so that we get bigger bang for a buck. When a cop goes out there, they're going to support the community because they're seen as a trained professional who behaves well, who knows what they're doing, they've got the skills and resources, and that's what professional policing is about. They're going to adhere to the rules and treat everybody fairly. You need fewer of those to have a really good impact, but we need a lot more social workers to really go into the communities where we see a lot of the problems with children being exposed to violence and work with those kids and those families to help those kids grow up in a consistent way so that they don't feel the need or don't react violently when they're becoming young adults and they don't feel that the world is a very kind place to them.
Crime stats are reported yearly. What is the main problem with this and how can and should this be corrected?
Well, where we've seen really big reductions in crime, we've seen that the foundation has been regular release of crime information to those cities and communities that were involved in those reductions. A good example that we use is that of Bogota in Colombia, because they had fewer cops than we had and they had a much more violent crime problem than we had. More violent robberies, more murders, and over the 10-year period, or from 1994 until the present day, have been able to reduce their robberies and murders by a greater proportion than we have. I think 75% less robberies and murders. So when we look at what they did, they started off by looking at how do they know what the crime problem is. So they got stats from universities, from the police, from their prosecuting authorities, from their health systems, looking at the morgues where injured bodies coming in. And then they combined and looked at which statistics were the most reliable, and then they released this monthly to show everybody where the problem was. And then communities can start seeing, okay, we've got a problem, robberies going up, or murders going up, or burglaries going up. It then is easier for the police to then get a partnership with those communities going, if it's the police that require it. It also takes the burden off the police, because sometimes organized communities that are largely organized around residents associations or business associations might think that they can do something themselves. So a group of businesses suddenly see that in their area last month, in the last few months, we've seen business robberies going up at the same time compared to the previous year. Then we've got to do something about it. So they might hire more private security. They might they might work together to put up lighting and palisades and stuff. So you see, people just using information can start seeing there's a crime problem and responding to it quickly. Then if you have an initiative and you implement it, you can then very quickly see if it's working or not. Because the next month when the crime stats come out, you can say, well, is crime in our area coming down or not? And if it's not coming down, then you need to rethink your strategy. If it is coming down, you know it works. And then you can share that knowledge with others. So information is the key to fighting crime. Otherwise, you're fighting it blindly and you're not going to really make much of a dent, as you've seen in South Africa. So if you release the crime stats monthly at a local level, you will provide the foundation upon which greater numbers of people can take practical action and measure the results of action to reduce crime in the neighborhoods, either with the police or without the police. The way we release crime statistics, it's once a year and it's 6 months out of date. So the crime statistics that were released a couple of weeks ago, their relevance ended on the 31st of March of this year. So we have no idea what the crime situation looks like at the present. So we're not able to design interventions and initiatives to prevent crime in our communities now, because no one knows what the crime situation is. And then if we do feel scared of crime and we do these things to try and fight crime, we have no idea if it's working until a year's time, which is too late. So the current policy of releasing crime statistics, which are paid for by public money, which are public information to save lives and improve safety, they're a public resource, should be made available as frequently as people want them, because the police system allows them to be updated every 24 hours. So the police could actually give crime stats as frequently as they wanted to. It might not be meaningful to do it every 24 hours. We think monthly is enough time to see whether you're getting trends going. But a policy taken in 2005 to only release them once a year, 6 months out of date, seeming to avoid accountability at the time, has fundamentally undermined the ability of the South African public to understand and respond effectively to the crime problem. It's an easy thing to change, and we really hope the new minister will think about this very carefully and sell this idea to Cabinet so they change that policy. We'll all be better off for it.
That was Gareth Newham, Head of the Governance, Crime and Justice Division at the ISS, speaking about the 2013-14 crime statistics.